Okay, so go ahead and create that app, and I'm going to open kind of a fresh one that I already have installed. Okay, so we're going to look at two different concepts today. One is helpers and one is components. So helpers, we kind of learned about when we learned handlebars, which was kind of like having little functions in our templates. So if you want to transform a value into something else for kind of like display logic purposes. So in this case, I think in the homeworks or the examples we did before, we wanted to take like a raw number and then put commas in between them. Or if you want to take like a raw date timestamp that maybe comes from an API or database and turn it into like a relative one, right? That would be a really great case for helper. So it's kind of like a function where it takes some value and spits back out a value. And so just like in handlebars, it kind of works essentially the same in Ember. And I'll just kind of show how to do that, and then we'll look at components. All right, so I'm just going to Ember service. I'm using a slightly different editor today. Trying something different. WebStorm, we have them free at work, so I was like, let me try this. Has like this built-in terminal, which is nice. So I can easily toggle between them. No, I've tried Vim before. It's hard. There's a learning curve. Yeah, you have to be pretty patient with that. I've been told. Okay, so if you want to go ahead and open up the templates and then application, we'll just kind of delete the welcome screen. Let me see how I can zoom in here. All right, hold on a sec. Control-Alt-S. Okay, never mind. I'm gonna go back to that. I don't know how to zoom. I was using it fine at work, but all right, so I'll go ahead and open up my console just to see if I have any errors. And okay, so let's do helpers first. So imagine we just have like a property, kind of like what we did. So we want to, let's say we just had a number, right? So kind of like with the Reddit API, we got a bunch of raw numbers, but they were pretty big, and we wanted to separate out them with commas. So in handlebars, we learned, just with raw handlebars, we learned we could create a helper, and we could call it maybe with commas, or you can kind of name it whatever you want. and then we could kind of pass in some long value. So this would probably be like a variable, but in this case, we'll just kind of leave it hard-coded in our template. And so behind the scenes, this would take this long number and then put a bunch of commas in between it. So the way we do this in Ember is we go to our command line, and we can say Ember generate helper, and we'll call this with comma, so the same name that we invoked it with. So this will create the JavaScript file in the helpers directory, and then it'll create a test, which we'll kind of look at next week. And so if we open this up, we can see with commas, it's basically just a function, and whatever we pass to it, so in this case, this number right here, it's in this array called params. So right now, it's just taking the value and spitting it back out. So here we could actually say, let's, so params is actually an array, and so the first item is the number. So we're going to say param 0, so get the first one in the array, and then we could say to locale string, so that built-in function on numbers. Okay, so if we look at our app, or our little page, we can see the 999 got formatted with a bunch of numbers. So with helpers, we can actually pass a number of things. So if we wanted to pass in kind of multiple arguments to this function, we can. And so imagine so we just separated them out with spaces. Now this example doesn't really make a whole lot of sense passing like extra numbers here, but in this case, I could just do a console log on params, and then we could see down here, it's just kind of an array that accepts everything. So in this case, I think just one number is fine for the helper, but maybe in certain cases, you might have a helper that you want to pass in multiple things. Well, you can do that. Yep.
My app's not recognizing the two locale strings as a command.
Is it, do you get like an error?
Yeah, it's saying like it doesn't recognize because it's cannot use property two locale strings. Oh,
Anybody else getting that? Let's see. So the helper name, space, and then the number. So it's a number, not a string. Is it? Do you guys have it like in quotes? No.
I think it is the parameter because it's not logging. Yeah, parameters undefined. It's not locale strings.
Params like this. You can also delete this like hash thing if, I mean, it won't conflict, but. What was it?
I fixed it.
What was the fix?
Deleting the hash thing.
Oh, really?
Even though it showed up as a comment.
Huh.
Oh, also, if you don't have enough nines, it doesn't work either.
Oh, yeah, you did more numbers.
Oh,
Which makes sense to it.
Yeah, actually, let me try that.
Yeah, it is. There's like a
99. Well,
I still should have blocked that.
there are no commas to put.
oh, I don't know. Maybe just having to like redefine that parameter after creating the helper,
Yeah, maybe.
or like it like just
Yeah, if you like
barely,
did this first.
like hashed something or something. It works now.
Cool. Yeah, so helpers are basically functions. You know, you pass it a value, it spits back a transform value, and they're really good for like display logic purposes. So kind of as we saw when we just did handlebars alone.
What happens if you want to pass in like, a parameter with a space between it?
Oh, like I want to say like this,
Or like a space B or something like
a space. Okay, so there's a space here like this.
that? Like within the string, does it know how to identify that there's a space in between?
Oh, like this.
Yeah.
Like this would be considered one argument.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. So typically, well, in this case, because it's a string, but you know, each space, each space is kind of like the comma in a function.
Okay.
Yeah. So I guess like one practical use case of this, where maybe you pass in like U.S. and so it puts in commas, but if you put like a European one, it puts periods or something like. You know, I could see that being another argument to this helper. Okay, so helpers are pretty straightforward. They're just functions. So the next thing we're going to look at is components. And so components are kind of like custom tags that we can define. So we all know like the tags built into HTML, right? Like div, p. They're just display static tags. We can actually create custom tags though, and they're called components, and they encapsulate HTML or templating and JavaScript. And so all the major frameworks are kind of built around this idea of components, and it's actually kind of a native thing. So there's something in the browser called web components, and but most people, you know, they're using frameworks, and these frameworks have kind of enhanced that idea of components to make it friendly with the framework and do all these extra things that I think maybe native web components don't necessarily do. So we're going to look at Ember components, but once you know the idea of components and how they work, hopping into React, Vue, Angular, it's all kind of the same stuff. It's just maybe slightly syntax difference. Okay, so I think a good example here is we're going to add an input, and we'll say value is equal to name. Maybe we have like some kind of form. I'll put a break tag. And so we've all kind of gone through forms, and you know how sometimes there's like a character limit on form inputs? It says like you can only put, I don't know, 20 characters in this input. And so underneath it, it'll say how many characters you have left. So if anyone use Twitter? No? Do you? Okay, yeah, so on Twitter, it kind of tells you like max 240 characters, and it says, you know, if you're about to hit that max or if you're getting close to it. So we can actually create a component to encapsulate that logic so that we can reuse it in multiple spots. So the way we can create a component, or we'll define a component called characters remaining. And so we're using kind of like HTML where we're using angle brackets. And what differentiates Ember components from regular HTML elements is that they're title cased. So title cased meaning each word starts with a capital letter, whereas like div, it's all lowercase. And so in Ember, we define a component like this, where it's title cased. And so we might want to pass some extra things to this component. We'd want to pass in the text, which in this case we'll say is the name. So whatever we pass, like whatever we type into this input, we're binding that value to the name variable, and that's going to get passed into this component. And then we might also want we probably want to tell the component like how many maximum characters should be allowed. So we want to say something like max is, the name can, we'll just say 10 for now. So in order to pass in kind of these extra parameters, we're going to prefix them with an @ sign. So this is just kind of how Ember components work. So we're going to say it's going to need the text, and it's going to need kind of the max number of characters that should be allowed. Yep.
This like syntax change recently?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm teaching the
Yeah.
newer one.
Okay.
I was gonna mention the older style and towards the end. Yeah. Okay, so we've defined a component, we passed in some extra things, and if we wanted to pass in like HTML attributes, we could do that too. So we could say things like class is equal to my class. Like I don't have one right now, but we'll just make up something. So okay, so we've kind of created or we've tried using this component that we haven't created yet. So let's go to our terminal, and we're going to say Ember generate component, and we're going to give it the name. So we say characters dash remaining. So the name of the file is not title case. It's kind of the hyphenated in all lowercase. So Ember G component characters dash remaining. And if we look at the files that were created, we get a JavaScript file and a handlebars file. So for the template. So there's kind of two pieces. It has the JavaScript file for custom JavaScript logic, and then the template for handlebars template. Okay, so let's open up these two files. So if we go in the components directory, we'll open up the JavaScript file, and then we will open up the template, which is in the templates components directory. So the files are called the same thing. One is a JS extension and one is a HBS extension. So there's kind of two pieces to it. Okay, so I'm going to ignore the yield part for a minute. We'll just kind of leave it at the end. It's kind of like outlet where it's not going to do anything right now, but it's not going to break anything. And we'll just say, we'll kind of hard code in here, 10 characters remaining. Okay, so we haven't typed anything, so it's kind of 10. And so we want to swap this out with kind of a dynamic variable that's calculated. And so if we think about the logic, it's essentially we want to take the length of the text that we passed in. So if we look at text, we want to take the length of it and do max minus the length, right? So we want to say max minus text.length. So that's essentially remaining is equal to kind of this expression. Okay, so this is a computation. And so we can kind of, a computation derived off of two properties that we have access to, max and text, and these were kind of passed into the component. So the way we do this is we can create what's called a computed property, which is kind of computing a property based off of some other properties you have, which in this case would be max and text. So we can say remaining, colon, and we're going to use this computed function. And so I'm going to pass into computed a function. And I'm going to say return this dot max. So we can access the arguments passed into the component. So arguments meaning anything that's prefixed with an @ sign. And so we can say this dot max minus this dot text dot length. So first thing we need to do is import this function because we don't have access to it in this module. So the way we import it is we can say import computed from Ember/object. And the next piece we have to do with a computed property is we have to list out which keys might change. So in this case, we would say, in all likelihood, like text is the one that's changing because as we're typing into the input, text is changing. So whenever text changes, recompute by executing this function. And so now that we have this computed property called remaining, we can go to our template, which is characters remaining, and we're going to change this hard-coded value, and we'll just put in remaining. I'm going to go back to the helper and delete the console log. Okay, so we're getting a warning here, and it says cannot read property length of undefined, and that's because right here we're trying to access length, and initially text is undefined. If we were to do kind of a console log on this.text, we would see undefined. So we should probably kind of guard against this. So we could do something like we could say let length, or let's say we can call this text length, is equal to, so we could say if there's this dot text, oh, I forgot, yeah, yeah, I'll explain this in a sec. Yeah, this is called a ternary statement. So it's another way of writing an if statement, which is essentially, so it's saying if there's this dot text, so if this exists, then the text length will say is this dot text dot length. Otherwise, we'll set it to 0. So we could have also written this like, we could have written it like this, where we say if this dot text text length is equal to this dot text length. Otherwise, text length is equal to 0. That's like another, like the longer way of writing it. So this is just kind of a regular JavaScript thing. It's called a ternary statement for short if statements. So. It's a nice shorthand syntax for like quick if statements. Shorter lines of code. Okay, and then we can go back down here, and instead of calling length, we'll say text length. So at this point, the error should go away, or the warning. Okay, so as we kind of type into this, we can see, okay, now it's changing. So it's recomputing every time, on every keystroke, because as we type into this input, we're changing the value of this variable name, which then gets passed into here, into this characters remaining component, and then we've declared this as a computed property so that whenever the text argument to this component changes, recompute this value. So if we were to actually go here and get rid of this text and then save it and then start typing, you'll notice that it doesn't recompute because we didn't declare text as a dependent key or a dependent property. Any questions?
Mine is still saying cannot read property.
Right here, did you have a minus text length, a variable?
Oh, no.
Mine's giving me an error for when I'm calling this. It's saying this is undefined.
This is undefined.
Zero.
Are you using a regular function, not like an arrow function?
Okay.
Is that it? Yeah. Yeah, for these, like the function, you can't use arrow functions for these, or for this particular case. Cool. Any other questions? All right, so we can kind of add to this. Let's say as I type, when I get past 0, I want to make this text red. Seems like a good user experience. So let's go to our styles directory in the app CSS, and we'll define a variable or a class, and we could say maybe we just call it error, and we'll say color red. Okay, so we have our color red. And if I inspect, do an inspect element on this character's remaining component, you'll notice that it's by default a div, and it has this ID attached to it, which is automatically generated by Ember. And there's a class. It has any Ember component has a class of Ember view, so it's just something you just shouldn't affect anything. But you'll notice that it has that my class here, which I kind of attached in here. So I say class is equal to my class. So it got it attached. We're not using it, so we could delete it. But I just wanted to show that you can pass in regular HTML attributes, and then things that aren't HTML attributes, they're prefixed with the @ sign. But by default, all components have a root tag, which is div. We can change that. But if I want to make this red, the way we can do this is we can use a property called class name bindings. And so I can bind a class name to a variable, and I can say give the class error, which we defined in our CSS, if based on some variable. And in this case, I could say something like, maybe we'll create a variable called is_too_long. So if is_too_long is true, then the error class will be applied. If it's false, the error class won't be applied. So all that extra logic of having to, add class or remove class is taken care of by Ember via class name bindings. So let's kind of define this is_too_long. So I'm going to do a comma, and I'll say is_too_long. And this is also another computed property. So we're going to compute is_too_long off of remaining. So we can say it's going to depend on remaining. And this will also take in a function. And what do you think the logic here might be? Yep. So we could say if this.remaining is less than 0, return true. Otherwise, return false. So if I try this out, it looks like it's working. So if I were to get rid of this computed and remove remaining and just say is too long, and I start typing, you'll notice that it doesn't work. So these dependent keys are pretty important because they say when these other properties change, that's when I'm going to recompute. We can even actually shorten this computed property to just be return this dot remaining is less than 0. And we could get rid of this in just another way of this will return a Boolean. So just another shorter way. This was kind of just a little bit more verbose. So if we go back and try this, you can see same thing. Any questions?
Mine's not working. I don't have an error, though.
No errors?
No errors, just
I guess you have the casing right, so it's like N and B are capitalized. Here, I'll put a comment here, ternary statement. So if we go back to our application HBF, we now have this reusable tag that we pass in some dynamic values, it recomputes, and we can use this across many inputs, so we don't have to kind of duplicate this logic anywhere. It's nice in just kind of one single tag. So by default, these Ember components are divs, and we see this here. We could actually change the tag name if you want to. So you could say there's another property called tag name, and we could say let's use a span tag if you want to do that. Oh, whoops, not a semicolon. Use a comma. So now if we look at this, you can see it's a span tag. So I'll comment this one out. I'll leave it as a div. So let's make this component a little bit better. So imagine in our app, or let's say we're using this characters remaining component across, maybe a few different apps. We want to share it, and or even just in our own app, and we want to make it customized so that in some cases, maybe it says characters remaining, but maybe you want to give a little bit of different verbiage in other situations. How can we accommodate that? So there's a couple ways we can do this. I'm going to copy this one. I'll just put maybe another break tag. Oops. I'll paste it here. I'll delete the my class. We don't need it in this case. And this was a self-closing tag, kind of like the image tag, so there was no closing tag. If we get rid of this and define a closing tag, so we can say characters remaining, so there's an opening and a closing tag. And we can pass in a block. And so what we pass in between the tags, I'll say something like characters remaining. And so this block that we passed in between the two tags is what this yield is. So if I save this, you're going to notice that in this second instance right here, we see characters remaining being output to the screen because this gets rendered in this yield. So maybe, I want this component to work in two different cases. If it's used like a self-closing tag like this, I just want to default it to, provide some default text. But if you pass a block, I want to use this instead. And so what we can do in our component is we can say pound if. We can say if has block. So has block is a custom variable inside of components. And we can say if there is a block, let's do the yield thing. Otherwise, let's do kind of the default. So this is kind of a reserved template keyword. And we're kind of yielding to the caller, which in this case is right here. So when I invoke it, I'm yielding to what's passed between the two tags. So if I look now, we can see the first instance still works as expected. And this one is kind of working, but it's missing the number. So how do we get that number? What we can do here is we can pass in remaining to the yield. So I can say take in that remaining computed property that we're using down here, and if I pass it to this yield, I can pass it back up to the caller, which if I go to application, we can receive here. I can say as keyword, and I'll say remaining, and then I could say maybe colon remaining. So I'm using this kind of special, Ember syntax where it says as remaining, and so that yield value is this, and then I can use it in between here. So we're kind of passing information back so it can be used in the section between the opening and closing tags. So this is kind of a nice way to make a component that maybe has some default templating, but if you want to give control back to the person using the component and say, hey, I'll let you provide your own templating, in this case this, then we can easily do that by passing in a block and yielding some of the data, which is in this case the remaining data, back out to the block. So if I look at this instance, we can see that it's working, and it's kind of supporting two different modes. And so in between here, we could even do things like, add in a p tag. Maybe we wanted to have more control over the markup. That's usually the case when we're kind of doing this, this block approach is I want to give more control to the caller of what markup to use. In this case, I want to maybe use a paragraph, but in this other case, I just want it to be a div. Then we can easily make this flexible. So if I inspect this right here, you'll notice that the Ember component is still a div, but there's a p tag kind of in between. So I type into this input, and it still works, but I'm providing two different markups for each one. Any questions? Yeah.
Do components automatically refresh itself if it senses a change in one of the properties?
Yeah. Yeah. So it'll that's kind of like the data binding in all these frameworks is when it changes. Now you could also like prevent it too, depending on your like certain situations and stuff. But yeah, when kind of one property changes and you pass it down to a component, it'll change kind of all over the place. I'll put like a little H2, I'll say characters remaining components. H2, I'll say any other questions? Is it working for people?
No, the red.
The red isn't? All right, let's go back.
How did you get it to work without the if statement?
Without, you mean this?
No, the red error.
Let's see, the red errors. So class name bindings, we have is too long, colon error. So it'll only apply this error class if is too long is true. And if it's false, then it'll remove it. So you do have to make sure it is too long, and this matches with this.
Wait, I have that, but
And then it's a computed. Does it depend on remaining?
yeah.
And also, do you have a comma like right here?
Yeah.
And then a function. And yeah, you could just say this remaining less than 0. Oh yeah, and then inside the app CSS, do you have a dot error color red?
I just spelled. I always
spelled error wrong. Spell things wrong.
Oh.
It's not working that. We're gonna figure it out.
It's probably just another spelling error somewhere else.
Yeah. Because like that's the only things not catching you. Sometimes you catch
Okay.
Okay.
It's probably a minor detail. All right, let's create another component. So this is kind of one example. Let's do one for, so I'm gonna put it above this one just so I don't have to like scroll. We'll call this async button component. I'll delete this. All right, so a lot of times in apps, right, we have like a save button, and this will be used on a create form or an edit form. And when we save something, it will hit an API, and that takes time, right? It will take anywhere from I don't know, 500 milliseconds to a couple seconds. And so it's nice to have feedback on the button. And so it'd be nice if, if you have like a save button, it says save and then it turns to saving and then it goes back to save after the API call is finished. Or if you're deleting something, maybe it goes from delete to deleting and it goes back to delete when it's finished. So let's make a button that kind of encapsulates all that. So I'm going to create a component called async button. And this will be a self-closing tag. And I'll say, let's give it some default text. Or, you know what? Actually, let's start with just saving. And so I want to say on click equal, and we're going to call some action. So I'll say curly curly action. And maybe in this case, it'll be like save user. All right, so if we were to, let's define this action. So we're just going to kind of make this up. We'll go to our terminal and we'll say Ember generate controller called application. So we're in the application template and it's going to look for that save user action in the application controller. So if I go to the application controller, I'll define that actions hash that we kind of learned about when we were doing actions, and we'll create one called save user. Okay, and so your page is probably not working because there's no component called async button. So let's go ahead and create that. So I'll say Ember generate component called async dash button. So it uses, again, like the hyphenated. Okay, so it's empty because our components by default are an empty div. So if we were to just kind of look right here, we see that here's the empty async button component. It's just a div with nothing in it. So we'll go to the async button JavaScript file and let's turn this into an actual button. So I'll say tag name is button. And then so we can kind of see our button here. Let's give it the default text. So if I go to the handlebars, and let's just say, we'll make this a variable and we'll say button text. So it's a variable called button text. And we'll define this variable on async button. So I'll say comma, and we'll say button text, and we'll just say this is called save. So now we have a button that says save. And we're going to change this as we do the call save user. So I'm going to go back to the application controller. So when I click on this async button, when I click it, it's going to call save user. So we're going to fake out the save user, and let's just say it takes 2 seconds. The way we can do this is, okay, so I'm going to start off by, I'm going to say import RSVP from RSVP. I'll explain this kind of once I type it out. And I'm going to say return new RSVP.promise. Okay, and then I'm also going to import later. I'll explain this. This isn't really the point. This is just kind of faking out like an AJAX call that takes 2 seconds. So I'll say at Ember run loop. And I'll say later. Okay, so I'll explain this. So I'm saying this save user, typically this would be like an AJAX call that returns a promise. Now I'm not doing any AJAX calls here, and so I'm essentially creating a promise myself through this RSVP thing. So this is kind of another library that's in Ember. We're just creating a promise, and I'm saying wait 2 seconds. So this is very similar to set timeout. So if, in plain JavaScript, we would do something like set timeout, wait 2,000 milliseconds, and then execute this function. And after 2 seconds, we're going to say, hey, let's resolve this promise. So we're just kind of faking it out. We're not like actually doing any AJAX calls. But instead of using set timeout, Ember has something called later. So it works like the arguments are the same as set timeout. The only reason we use later is that it's kind of more Ember aware, which is useful for like testing and stuff. And it makes it's like an Ember aware version of set timeout. So when later is called, Ember can like keep track of things and do optimizations and stuff. So so it's basically a set timeout. So in reality, you wouldn't probably ever type this in like a real app or anything. This is just faking out a 2-second delay function that returns a promise. Okay, so going back to the component, I want to say when I click it, when I click on this async button, invoke this action that's passed in, so this onClick. So I'm going to add in a method called click on the component, and I'm going to say this dot onClick, and we'll execute it. And so I want to say, I want to put the button text to be saving right when I click it, and then after onClick finishes, we're going to put it back to save. So I'm going to say this dot set, and so set's a function built on components and other Ember objects. So I'm going to say this dot set the button text to be saving, and maybe like dot dot dot. And so we'll invoke onClick that's passed to it, and we'll call then on it. So onClick returns a promise, because if we go back to application, we return this kind of promise that takes 2 seconds to resolve. So we'll say we'll execute onClick when it's clicked, and then we're going to say this dot set button text back to save. So if I click on this button, waits 2 seconds, and we can see it goes from saving to and then back to save. It's kind of a nice like button for a form that you could use in both like create and edit forms. Now you can even make this fancier instead of doing just like dot dot dot, throw in like a spinner and all that, make it fancier. But any questions? All right, so let's imagine I want to make this a little bit more reusable and have this work for deleting a user. So instead of saying save user, let's say we had one for delete user. So I'll change this action to delete user. And I'm going to go to the application controller and just copy this same action and then just rename it. So I'll say delete user. So same exact thing. Just kind of faking out faking out an API call to delete a user, which in this case, is 2,000 milliseconds or 2 seconds. Now, our button right now only says save, so let's make this something that's configurable that we pass in. So I'm going to go to each of these, and I'm going to say, let's make this an argument to the component. So I'll have maybe an attribute called default text, and in this case, it'll say save. And then we'll also have another attribute called pending text, and this is equal to saving ... And I'm going to just break these out onto multiple lines. And then we'll do the same. So we'll say at default text is equal to delete. And then pending text is equal to deleting. And I'll just break these out onto multiple lines. Yeah. Yeah, I just copied this and just renamed it to delete user. Yeah. Okay, so we go to async button.js. Let's kind of use the arguments that we passed in. So we could change this saving to this dot pending text, and then we'll say this dot, or kind of when it finishes, we'll say this dot default text, and then we want the initial value to be also the default text, but we can't right here. We can't use this dot default text because this is only available when the component is newed up, and so we can get rid of this. We'll comment this out, and we're going to say init, which is kind of like constructor when we learned about classes, but this is like the constructor for an Ember component. So when this component is newed up, it'll invoke this init function, and we have to call super just to kind of preserve the default behavior. And you'll see this kind of notation a lot, but it's arguments is kind of it's a keyword in JavaScript for every single function. So arguments is like an array that just of all the arguments for a function, which in this case would be whatever was passed to init. So we could say take all the arguments and just spread them out. So in this case, like if there were two arguments like a and b, this would essentially be the same as saying this dot super a comma b. So it's like a shorthand notation, but it's really useful if you don't know like how many arguments this was invoked with. In this case, we never really invoke the Ember component ourselves. Ember kind of does that behind the scenes. So we're just going to say take whatever arguments you gave us and then just spread them out in the call. So call the original init, but kind of spread them out. So you'll just kind of see this in a lot of different hooks or different methods like in Ember classes and stuff. It's called the spread operator, if you want to look it up. Okay, so I'm going to say this dot set the button text to this dot default text. So now if I save it, we can see that the button text is now set to delete. So if I were to get rid of this and just comment it out, you'll notice that these buttons don't actually have anything. If I were to click it, you'll see it, it gets the pending and the default, but not initially. So we do need this extra line to set the button text to the default text when the component's instantiated. So now if we go and click this, you can see it works. Delete, deleting, save, saving. And so oh yeah, question.
Mine, like, for the saving, it would go to this dot default text is what it says instead of saving. How do you fix that?
So initially, you'll say set the button text to the default text, and then when you click it, it should immediately set it to the pending text. Do you have that?
Yeah.
And then on click then, and then you do you have a fat arrow function? And then you set button text back to default text. And then in the template, you have this as button text over here.
So it's button text?
Yeah, because that's like the value we're displaying. So does that all look? And then comment this piece out.
Yeah, it should be able to see.
Yeah. Anyone getting any errors or? Is it working for anybody else? Yeah. All right, so I'm going to go to this click function. I'm just going to put a console log, and I'll just say clicked. And if I view this, and if I look at the save, or if I click on the save button, I can actually click it a bunch of times, right? And so if this were like an Ajax call, I just clicked it 12 times, right? So it's probably not good if somebody could in theory do that and just no good, right? We want to disable the previous clicks and only allow it so once they make the call, don't let them click it again until it's finished. And so does anyone know the HTML attribute on buttons so that we can prevent multiple clicks? Yeah, disabled. Yeah, so we can add disabled. This is just regular HTML. We can say button disabled equals, I think as long as the attribute's there, just disable whatever the value is, it'll disable the button. So we can actually do this, and we can bind a variable to this and say, kind of like what we did with characters remaining, where we said class name bindings, and we said apply this class when this is true. So we can do the same thing, but there's another one called attribute bindings, and this is for things like the disabled property or the disabled attribute on buttons. So I can say attribute bindings. And so I want to bind to the disabled attribute. And maybe we want to create a property called isPending. So when it's pending, we want this to be disabled. And so we'll create a property called isPending. Well, actually, we could do this a couple ways. We could actually just say when it's clicked, let's do this. We'll say is pending, and we'll default this to false. And so right when we click it, we'll say this dot set is pending, and it's true. And then once the kind of the on-click fake AJAX call finishes, we'll set this set is pending is false. And so now if I click this, you can see that I can't do multiple clicks because the button's essentially disabled. Now another way we could have actually implemented this is instead of kind of setting this flag, we could have created another computed property that says if the button text is pending, it says the is pending text, then it's pending. So that's like another way we could have done it. So just something, there's multiple ways to kind of achieve these. Any questions? All right, so I want to do one more component. I'll kind of close these. Actually, I'll put this up here just to turn off the scroll again. All right, so we're going to call this component my switch. So the thing with component names right now, they actually have to be 2 words. Well, sort of. Basically, they have to be 2 words. I know like Ember is changing a little bit, so eventually it'll just be 1 word, but for now it has to be 2 words. So I'm calling it, that's why the my instead of just switch.
Maybe more than 2 words?
Yeah, it can be more than 2 words. So actually it's well, let me get into it at the end. Yeah. I'm going over kind of like the brand new way of doing components, which is the current version, Ember 3.4, which is actually what we're using now. This whole like angle bracket syntax is pretty new, but this is kind of the future of components in Ember. Whereas if you look at the docs, you'll see a slightly different syntax. But I'll get into kind of maybe that at the end. All right, so we'll say my switch and we'll say on or at on is equal to on. So let's okay, I'm gonna call this something else. I'm gonna call this feature enabled. So imagine like we're gonna use this switch and we want to turn something on and off like in our app, right? Maybe we want to give access to a certain feature, and and so this this my switch component will toggle a value called feature enabled. So in our controller, our application.js, we can maybe create this and we'll say feature enabled is we'll say true for now. Oh, yeah. So we're just defining a variable on this controller called feature enabled. We set the value to true. And so since this is on the controller, this will be passed into the component here. So on will be this feature enabled, which is true. So I'm going to open up my switch. Actually, I'll just, oh, I didn't create it yet. All right, so let's go to the terminal. We'll say Ember generate component called my switch. So I'll open up the JavaScript file and the template. All right, so we passed in one attribute called feature enabled, so it's passed in as an argument called on. And so in our template, maybe we want to do something like this, where we say pound, if. So if, and we can access this attribute in our template via @on, so it's kind of like just the way we passed it. So @on, close the if. So if it's on, and let me kind of finish out the if else part. Then we'll show a button. That says off. So if it's on, then we could turn it off by clicking off. Or maybe we say something like turn off. And then otherwise, if it's false, then we'll kind of give the option to turn it on. And actually, we could probably clean this up. Instead of duplicating the markup twice, a better approach would probably be this, where we just say, just use the same button, and then just, yeah. So we'll say if @on. All right. Yeah, so that's kind of at least one button tag, so we don't have multiple, because that could get a little weird. Okay, so let's kind of add a click handler. So when I click this, I want to change this value, this on, right? So kind of right above the button, I'm just going to put a data binding expression for feature enable, just so we can see kind of the value that's being passed into it. So we can see it's true by default. And then in my switch.js, we could say, or going back to the template, let's put an on-click on this button. So we'll say on-click is equal to action, and we'll say toggle. All right, so let's go to the my switch.js, and we'll define this action. So we'll create that actions object, and we'll say define this toggle function. Yep.
Why are we defining actions this time inside the components.js instead of application.js?
Oh, because let's see. So in this case, we were passing in an action to the async button called save user or delete user, because in an app, this app might use this button in different spots for different asynchronous functions, and in this case, we wanted this, I guess, more configurable, right? Because I want to use this in the save user and the delete user case. In this my switch example, I'm just saying I just want to well, we're eventually going to get to this. So I guess let me finish and then we'll revisit your question. Okay, so when I click on this button, I want to toggle this on property. So I'm going to say this.set on, and I want to do the opposite. So I can say, well, there's actually a method inside Ember components. We can say toggle property. So we could say this.toggle property on. Another way we could have written this is we could have said something like this.set on to this.on and do the opposite. So not on. But this one probably reads a little bit better. Okay, so if I look at this, you can see it's working. So it's true, so it's enabled. I can turn it off, and it turns it to off. And I can turn it back on, and it kind of just toggles back and forth. So any questions up until this point?
Can you go back to the handlebars for my switch?
Yeah. Yes.
So in general, you want to declare your actions on components, right, instead of controllers.
I wouldn't say it's either or. It kind of depends on the situation, because components can have actions too. So like a component typically isolates like markup, and in that markup you might have some action, so you would need kind of the actions inside the component. But then say like in this example with async button, I want to use this async button in multiple spots for like creating a user, editing a user, deleting a user. And so in this case, I created a button that, in which case the action was defined based on like maybe the route which is attached to the controller, and I pass that in so that when you click on the button, it kind of it calls that behind the scenes. So it's not really either or. It just depends on the scenario. Yeah. But in this case, I was just trying to make async button reusable, so that like if I didn't pass this and the async button called kind of like save user inside of it, then I wouldn't be able to reuse it in multiple spots. Okay, so looking at this My Switch button, it's a little bit limited where it's working kind of like in this one situation. But what if I wanted to fire an AJAX call right when I clicked it? So as soon as I turn on the feature or turn off a feature, I want to persist this via API to the back end, and this actually disables the feature or the feature. So how can I do that? So if I were to look at this, I could, one way I could go into this switch and then do $.ajax or whatever, right? I could do the AJAX call in here. But anyone think if this is a good idea? Why not?
I have no idea.
It's so far away from like what you that
Yeah, that's kind of on the right track where it's kind of far away from the main page, which is like the main page is tied to the feature, right? But if I were creating this as like a reusable thing that might be used in multiple spots, then this component would be tied to toggling that very specific feature, right? And I wouldn't be able to reuse it. Or I'd have to add a bunch of logic in here that maybe says like, in this case, toggle this feature. In this other case, toggle this feature. I wouldn't be able to kind of reuse it in different spots. Now maybe that's fine. Maybe if it's like this one switch I want to use just in this one spot of my app, it's it might be okay. But generally, it's nice to have it so that it's somewhat reusable, especially for like a switch, right? Where you'd probably, if you have an app that has lots of forms, it's likely you would probably have a switch in multiple spots. So maybe you make it a little bit more reusable. So as opposed to modifying this feature directly, what we can do is modify this so that we call an action. So we could say onClick equals action. And we could say, whenever this switch is clicked, we could say toggle feature. So I'm inside application HBS. So I'm going to go to the application controller, and we'll add this action in. So we'll say toggle feature. So I at least have the action there. And then going into this component, instead of calling toggle property, I'm going to say this.onClick, and I'm going to invoke it with the new property. So I'm going to say the opposite, which is not, or let's call it, we'll say this.on. So we're kind of taking the original property that was passed in on, and we're toggling it via the exclamation point, which is the inverse. And so for this component, instead of modifying on directly, I'm just saying let's call onClick when it's clicked, and I'll change the value, or I'm going to invoke that function with the new value, but I'm not going to set it. So if I were to click on this thing, you'll notice that it gets clicked, but it's not changing, right? And so if we were to go back to the toggle feature action, we'll say new value. And if I say this.set, and we called it feature enabled. So I'll say this.set feature enabled is new value. We're going to just rewrite it. And if I go and try this out, oh, wait, hold on. let me. Hold on 1 second. It's not working as I expected.
Because in the HPS, the toggle feature is not expecting the variable. Passed in.
Mouse event. Oh, I forgot the @ sign. Ah, keep doing that.
So if you don't use an @ sign, is it just like
Yeah, so with these like this angle bracket syntax, you have to prefix any component arguments with an @ sign, and if it doesn't, it treats it as an HTML attribute.
okay.
So yeah, so kind of like down here when I said class didn't have it, but then these did. Yeah, this became an HTML attribute, but these didn't. Okay. Cool. So now it's kind of working as expected. So I'll delete these console logs. Okay, so kind of going over how this whole thing works. We pass in the initial value, which is labeled as the on argument, which is set to feature enabled, which was true. And when I click on it, so in the button, if we look at the template, when I click on it, we call the toggle action of the component. And then it just delegates, so it calls the on-click action that was passed in, or yeah, the action that was passed in with the new value. And it's up to the action, so in this case, toggle feature, it's up to that to reset it. And if we don't set it and we just say, just leave it empty, you'll notice that it doesn't actually change. And so this component, I kind of wanted to show a paradigm as part of components called data down, actions up. It's so let me type it out. It's data down, actions up. You'll see the acronym data down, or like DDAU. In React, they call it like, I think, one-way data flow, but it's the same concept. And so kind of, so what this paradigm says is any data that's passed to a component, so in this case, like on, it's passed to it, this component shouldn't modify it. So if we look at it, this component isn't modifying on, right? It's delegating to an action that's passed in. So it's saying when it's clicked, don't modify on, but instead call on click with the new value and let the owner of the data modify it. So in this case, the owner of feature enabled the owner of this is the application controller, right? Because this is where it's defined. So you can think of the controller as owning this piece of data because that's where it's defined. So where it's defined is also where it should be modified, which in this case, we're modifying it in this action right here. And so we're kind of, we're passing the data down into the MySwitch component, and we're delegating to an action by calling toggle feature and allowing this to modify the data where it was kind of originally declared.
I think I passed down, but then passed right back up a little.
Yeah. So like the data goes down, and then it calls the on click that was passed, so it kind of goes back up. So it's kind of like this one-way data flow thing.
And then why wouldn't you just make an action on it? And you could, like, have the on click, have an action. And then, okay, I guess, yeah, you get an extra little piece of data.
Yeah. So like the goal of this whole paradigm is essentially to say, hey, like if you look at a component, anything that you pass to the component, that component shouldn't modify because that component doesn't own it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So MySwitch doesn't own the data for on because it was, passed in and it came from the controller. So don't modify it. So it can, expose new values of it, but let the owner of that data modify it. So this is just kind of like a paradigm that you'll see if you're working pretty much with any JavaScript framework. They kind of follow this components shouldn't modify data technique. So in Ember, it's called data down, actions up. React, they kind of call it like, I think it's like controlled inputs or one-way data flow, something like that. And especially when you start seeing like add-ons or, you start working with other Ember libraries, you'll probably run into components designed this way that follow this data down, actions up. So any data you pass to it, it's not going to modify it for you. You have to be responsible for modifying it, but it will call like functions that you pass in and give you ways of setting it yourself. So in this case, we were able to set it because it exposed an on-click attribute, at which point we were able to kind of rewrite the new value. So we declare feature enabled here, but we also modify an action in the same spot. And so going back to kind of like the original question I asked is like, how would I do it if I wanted to do an Ajax call and save? Well, right in this action, I could say $.ajax and kind of save. I can do other things. So I get the new value, I can set it, and then I could essentially do whatever I want with this new value. I don't have to set it if I don't want to. Maybe I don't want to in a certain case, but in this case, I kind of wanted to. Any questions? This whole data down, actions up thing, it can be confusing. It took me a little while to grasp too, but I'd say like the main takeaway is just anything you pass into a component, any data, if you're following data down, actions up, then it shouldn't modify that data that's passed into it. Now I'd say like in some cases, maybe you want to follow data down, actions up. In others, maybe you don't. It kind of depends. But in general, if you're creating like a reusable component, like in this case where we have my switch and this switch could be used in other spots of my app, then you probably want to follow data down, actions up. If you're creating kind of like a one-off component just for maybe this one form, you don't need to. So it kind of depends.
So all the data needs to be modified in the controller, is what you're saying?
It should be modified in the same spot where that data was defined. Yeah. So like in this case, feature enabled was defined in the controller, so there was an action in that same controller to modify it. And my switch did not modify it. Yeah, so if we were to look at kind of like input, right? Input is sort of like a special Ember component. This is actually not like data down, actions up, because if we pass in a value called name into it, as we type into it, we're actually modifying name, right? So this does not follow data down, actions up. And that's fine, right? In some cases, like the opposite of data down, actions up, they call it two-way binding. So we're just binding directly to this as it changes. And it's very convenient, right? So it kind of depends on the situation. I think for reusable stuff, the data down actions approach is great, but maybe for like inputs in your own forms, like, this doesn't really adhere to data down actions up, that's okay. Okay, so just one thing I wanted to mention before we end is all of this stuff, like all these components I was showing you, the new syntax in Ember is they call it angle bracket syntax, and it looks like HTML just with a few modifications. So it has like title casing, custom properties that are passed in are prefixed with an @ sign. Any regular HTML attributes just don't have the @ sign in front of it. Ember is kind of transitioning to this style of components, but we could actually invoke this same component this way. So using the curlies, and we say like my switch on is equal to feature enabled, on click is equal to action toggle feature. So this is probably what you'll see in the docs, and this is kind of like the older style. And this is kind of the translation. So if you just kind of like an FYI, because most things online will probably have this older one, but they're going to slowly change it, and this will become kind of a predominant way of invoking components. So more of just like an FYI. Okay, so let's go over the homework. So I put some links here for like links to the guides for computed properties, helpers, components, data down, actions up. So if you just want to read more about it, this one actually is a video. So if you want to watch like another example, it's a really good video. So I think this one does like a color picker. I think this video also is using the older syntax. So just FYI if you're watching things, or you'll see the older one. And then for the assignment, so it's the second part of Gmail. So we did the truncating of the text, of the email text, like on the list using plain CSS. So instead, create a helper that does this. So you'll take in the text and then trim it just using JavaScript. So that's the first piece. The second piece is you're going to create a star button component, and it's going to be invoked like this. And it's going to follow that data down actions up, where you pass in a star, like the star. So this will be true or false. And when you click it, it's going to kind of toggle this. And I want you to persist this to the database. So like today I mentioned, if I wanted to toggle the feature, I could do an AJAX call. But in this case, you're going to modify a property on the email. You'll create one called starred. It'll be true or false. And you'll update that. So it's kind of just going one step further, where you're going to modify a property on the email itself. And then, okay, and then the next piece is you're going to kind of split up your list of, your list of emails. So the top section will show the starred ones, and then anything else will be after that. So it's, you'll use a computed property there, kind of on a controller, and filter it out based on starring them or not. So you'll push to the same repo, just keep pushing to that one, and that should be it. Any questions? Cool. All right, we'll end for today.